Hey, listener, did you know that May 9th this year is Webcomic Day? That's right, it's a whole day dedicated to celebrating webcomics. You can participate on social media by posting about your comic or about a webcomic that you love and using the hashtag Webcomic Day. Learn more about it by visiting webcomicday.com.
Just do it! Don't let your dreams be dreams. Yesterday said tomorrow. So just do it! Face your dreams untrue!
Hello, and welcome to Screen Tones, where we talk anything and everything webcomics. Today we're going to be talking about balancing your story's plot with character development. I'm Crispy, my pronouns are she, they, and I make the comic Ghost Young Sickness.
Hi, I'm Finn. My pronouns are they, them, and I make the webcomic Heirs of the Veil.
Hi, I'm Verathane, and my pronouns are she, they, and I make the comics Chiralt and Witchwood.
So, you're working on your comic, and you've put together some sort of plan to figure out your story's plot. Over the course of creating pages, sometimes it can be hard to flesh out the characters and the plot equally. This is an issue that mostly affects plot-heavy stories, as opposed to comics that are more free-form or gag-a-day, but it's an interesting challenge, and our speakers have a lot of fun talking about it. So we're going to talk about it. First question I'm going to talk to both of you, or ask both of you. When you're reading a comic and the balance between characters and plot isn't working, what does that really look like?
For me personally, I think the most grating is when I really notice that the characters just hop along like the plot lines that the author has set for them. Sometimes it can be very obvious because the characters don't seem to act on their own. But oh, there is that station, they have to go from station A to station B, so they do that. And that's what happens. I think that's especially annoying to me when characters get into difficult situations, and in the end, the situations get resolved not through the characters, but through some outside source or more plot happening, and it can feel very unearned.
Yep. Yeah, it feels very linear, and they're just like, well, they're there because the plot dictates it so, yeah, big agree with that one.
Yeah, ideally it should all be kind of working together symbiotically, if you would. I find when I'm reading through a story, if the balance isn't quite landing for me, it can go in two directions. Because there's the direction where the characters are not receiving enough development and they're just kind of following along like the strings of the plot. But it's also possible for the plot to be undeveloped because, I mean, again, this is something that not every type of story will have issues with, because if the focus is entirely on just characters interacting with each other and not really on having a linear plot, then that's fine. But what the plot can provide to the story is things like stakes and consequences and like things that will make the reader kind of be on edge about like, oh, what's gonna, like, if you know that something bad might happen to the character, or that a character has like a strong goal that they're trying to meet and there's a challenge in the way of them getting it, that's kind of where the tension and the intrigue can come from for the reader. And so not enough focus on the plot is kind of where you can kind of lose some of those things. You'd be like, all right, fun characters, but like when is something going to happen?
Yeah, it's essentially that they're just kind of like batting around or almost walking aimlessly to a degree. I mean, like you said, it could be fun to see the banter, to see the shenanigans, but there still has to be a point to a lot of it, always dependent on genre, because, you know, it does fluctuate depending on what kind of story it is, but we're still having readers going through the story. There has to be a plot or a point to a scene and to a moment and stuff like that. So some of it can actually get pretty frustrating, like Finn was kind of saying, with, you know, how some of it kind of goes along and kind of almost feels like I was saying pointless when you don't have those two kind of balance, because you can actually have characters go through this epic momentous moment, but, you know, if there wasn't enough development on the characters, the stakes kind of feel flat and empty. And when the realization kind of comes to a turn, maybe you're going to have some readers experience the cricket noises and stuff like that. You're not going to get the drum rolls and the fanfares that you were expecting when something drops because, there wasn't enough development for the reader to have that investment in.
So, to the point of things that can feel unearned, this is kind of more of on the plot side again, but there's a trend that I think a lot of people really dislike the term Deus Ex Machina, because it kind of stands for something that feels inherently unearned in the plot of a story. And I feel like that can be something that happens with kind of insufficient planning on the creator's end of things when kind of figuring out the sequence of events that they're going to take the characters through. And it tends to happen when they've written the characters into a problem and can't figure out a good way to get them out of it. And it can feel kind of unsatisfying just because when you rely on a coincidence to get the characters out of a problem, it really hurts kind of the investment from the readers because it's like, oh, well, they went through all that and that was that easy? Like, oh, a random new person jumps in and saves the day or something like that. Because I feel like what people tend to really gravitate towards is watching the characters work and strive towards a solution. Then that's kind of what helps make it feel earned, like is seeing people going through the process of solving a problem, like deliberately with their own actions. This is actually a quote from somewhere else, and I wish I could remember where it was from, but you can use a coincidence to get your characters into trouble, but you can't use a coincidence to get them out of it because it's going to feel kind of hollow.
I remember specifically, this was something that kind of happened in my experience of watching something like The Dragon Prince. Was it? And a lot of the things were kind of hard to get invested in because a lot of convenient things had happened that didn't feel very earned and something like that. So it made me, step back from it and not give as much care as I could to some of the characters, even though I wanted to like them. It was just like, there's no growth happening. There's no, like problem solving. I'm not seeing how this individual is tackling this problem. I'm not seeing them kind of be themselves with the plot and with things like that. So it does take away a lot when you just kind of usher your characters through the plot and be like, okay, the plot is this. Let's push them through like, people at a crowded convention. Like, come on, let's go. No time to look in that booth or, whatever, smell the flowers.
We need to get to point B.
Yeah. So it feels like really rushed, and when I see stories like that, it's disheartening because there are things that as a reader you're reading the story and you're just like, it's a really good plot, but oh god, I just wish I cared.
But is the plot really good if you don't care about it because the characters are underdeveloped? And I think, like, adding to your point, Crispy, I think what the reader expects, or what we also like want to do as writers, we put these characters in these difficult situations so that they will develop. So if like they get saved over and over, or the situations get solved by outside forces, like you said, the development does not happen. So why are the obstacles even there? Like, what do they do?
Yeah. That's exactly it. It's just like, why does it matter at the end?
I feel like some of the plots like that, you just kind of come out of them thinking, like, this would sound very interesting as a Wikipedia article or a Reddit thread, but, like, did I actually need to spend an hour on it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
Oh my god, yes. Gosh. I'm gonna kind of segue to our next question then. Sometimes characters can feel underdeveloped when they're just following a very, clear plot structure like we've been discussing. How do you personally deal with and avoid that in your own works then?
I think this is actually something that's really hard. Like, okay, I've been harping on this happening, but I think it's very challenging to actually not just stick to the plot because you get so caught up in your own head. You have your plot line and you're like, okay, the characters are there, so they have to go from there to over there. And sometimes you like kind of lose the characters' personalities a little bit.
Yes.
So what I personally do, or what I did, because I got into situations like that before, is to just take a step back and think about what would the character do what would be in line for the character to do?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
can this move the plot forward? And if this doesn't move the plot forward, do I have to change other things? Would another character in the situation maybe work better, for example?
Yeah.
Because sometimes you really have to like take maybe a bigger step back and think about, okay, do I need to restructure this completely so it's in line with the characters still?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. Just, one of the things that I always think about when I get into kind of like those like moments and stuff like that is like I definitely have the advantage with being the co-author of Ghost Junk, so I do always have someone to bounce those ideas off of. But sometimes, I mean, both of us will be like, "Yep, this is what's happening," and then it happens, and we're like, "Well, heck, they're in a hole now, and how do we get out? And this doesn't make sense." And I'm not going to put some magic plot thing to be like, "Ah, yes, it's better. We all make sense." But one thing that I really like to do is to get inside the character's head and know how like they will interact with the moment. And like, is it truly in character for them to act just like X way just to move the plot along? And will this create contradictions in characterization as you're kind of going along? And sometimes you see that. Sometimes you see that in works where a character is super whatever in the beginning, and then all of a sudden they make this weird, unexplained kind of, decision that, doesn't make sense, that didn't actually have anything to do with the plot as you read further along. And it was just a moment to be like, oh, I think the author was in a hole.
I feel like the classic example of like a story that kicks off in a very kind of not very character driven way is like that D&D RPG setting where like all the characters just kind of happen to meet in the same tavern and then they take on the same job
Yes.
together, and it's so convenient, and it can
Mhm.
kind of be forgiven if like the stuff that happens afterwards is interesting. But it's one of those, the ends can justify the means, but only if the ends are really cool. Like, you better have something great
Yes.
planned down the line for this kind of thing to actually work, to give people faith that it's not just going to kind of be the same level of like, well, here we go. Our employer told us to go hunt down this dwarf, so we're going to do that. All right, here we are coming back. We finished the job. Let's take the next job.
And like in that aspect, it does become monotonous and becomes very like, very easy to tell where things are going on, predictable to tell where the plot is going to go. And, sometimes you do want your reader to be sometimes a step ahead. Sometimes, you want them to pick up enough crumbs to be like, hey, you know where this is going. Maybe you have a twist and it's going to be fun or whatever. But, it is good writing when they pick up when things are going to go somewhere. But when it's just like, okay, well, I guess I know how this scene's going to be wrapped up because we're just going to have something convenient happening. And, that's hard. I think at that point, it's hard to justify how awesome your plot is if that's the reactions that you're getting. If your plot is some awesome, epic, awesome sauce, but, this is the way that we're going there, it's just like, okay, again, like Thane said, it looks great on paper, but
I actually, in line with the question about like how do you personally deal with that, I actually did have kind of a big issue with it while I was planning Witchwood, or rather not while I was planning it, because while I was planning it, I was having a lot of fun, like nailing down this outline and putting together like plot beats in a line and being like, oh yeah, after that happens, this will happen, and then this will happen. It'll be great. It's going to be so much fun. And then I got to the point of actually turning these things into a comic. And it got to be kind of tough at some points in the story because, in a way, this is due to the nature of the first arc that I had planned out. Because I had these two characters who get captured and put into an environment where they're very much out of their element. And they kind of are being forced to go along with what their captors want them to do. And that's, I mean, it's not a great place to be. In this case, the characters made a decision early on to kind of go along with what their captors told them to do to kind of make things easier for themselves. Like, they were always planning to try to escape, but they were like, we're going to have an easier time if they don't know the full extent of our skills and they're not aware that we are wanting to get out so badly. So we'll pretend like we're okay with this. And that's kind of difficult to really convey the personalities of a character when you immediately put them into a situation like that, especially if their personality is not supposed to be like goes along with anything. So I kept running into scenes where I would have written in the outline, like, oh, like they do some like, magic tests or something like that. And I had the character just kind of go along with it. And I was like, I think I actually fully drew out a scene, and then I like had it up, and one of my beta readers was like, is this really, is she actually putting up with this? Like, is she really like,
Is this happening
she
right
really
now?
just went along with it, huh? I was like, oh no, it's true. I have to fix this. So I went back. I actually did revision passes on many, many scenes throughout that first arc. Some scenes I went back and redrew like twice because I wasn't even happy with the first attempt at like revising it. Because there's a lot of like little personality things that were getting kind of lost in the original versions of some of these scenes because I was so focused on getting
Yes.
through my outline, basically. And I was like, I gotta move this plot along. I don't want it to be 600 pages before like the big thing that I'm looking forward to. So I've got to just got to keep things moving, hustle through. But sometimes you don't get to really show a character's actual personality and drives like that. And that could seriously hurt a story. So even if it had taken, like in my case, I managed to find a solution that didn't require like an enormous amount of, I mean, it was, I did redraw like 50 pages, but I didn't have to
50.
add those to the story. They were just revising and like tweaking dialogue and stuff like
Yeah.
that. But like, it could have seriously expanded the story. And if that had been the cost, I would have gone for it, because taking that, like sacrificing the character development is something that's so fundamental to like the appeal of the story that like I don't think it would be worth it. Like, sure, I've moved my plot along, but at what cost?
Yeah, I think that's like a really hard balance because some people really don't want to spend all that time on developing the characters, maybe because they're planning a shorter story and are trying to like get as much as they can into it and like move it along at a very quick pace. I know that this is kind of what we attempted with Heirs of the Veil when we first started. So I can really relate because I think we ran into similar issues, and then some when like at the end of chapter 4 I was kind of like thinking, okay, here's the plot, here's where it needs to go, but it didn't fall together very well because it was slow, it felt really constructed to me. Like, I think we were talking about this before at some point, that I'm worried about that characters might feel like puppets because like it is a play, it's something we construct, but we really don't want people to see the strings, we don't want them to see that this is what's going on. So that was the point where I took a step back and then basically let one of the characters do her own thing, and this really catapulted the plot into a good direction again, where I felt happy with it and where I also felt that it was like driven by the characters and not by me just like playing with
Yeah.
my toys and moving them on like a board.
Yeah.
And then they kiss.
Yeah. Soon.
Very soon.
We actually almost named this episode Seeing the Hand of the Author, kind of in line with that. Like those moments where your suspension of disbelief is kind of broken and you're like, I see what you're doing, writer. I see you, in fact.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, but that's a very big thing that it's so true, though. I mean, the whole point of us recording this episode is because, I mean, we've seen lots of examples of it and kind of how to avoid it or how we deal with it. One of the things that I try to do when we do get forced into those places is actually come up with alternate universe kind of theories of it and be like, okay, I'm going to take this character that maybe I don't fully understand how they got into this situation. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I need the plot and they're here, but why? And I as the writer need to understand that. I need to understand that so that as I'm writing it and conveying it for the readers, they understand it too. Kind of like what Thane said with, you know, Tiara doing something that a reader's like, does this make sense? And Thane being like, oh my gosh, it does not. And I just like to put them in kind of like situations, maybe something similar, or pushing beyond what could happen and seeing where it would end up. And if it's to a point where the character loses the correct quote unquote characterization, I'm just like, okay, then this doesn't make sense to go in this direction. And yes, there is obviously times where the plot will move the characters along depending on some kind of event that's happening, but like the story is still focused around these people navigating the story as well.
I feel like this is where having beta readers or like some sort of peer review or like any kind of system for getting feedback on things as you're working on it could be so useful, because they can kind of, sometimes even without realizing it, like point out things that you weren't fully aware of. And one of the most ambiguous and kind of hardest to track as an author areas is exactly how the personalities of your characters are coming across.
Yes.
Because you as the author, you already know everything about them, and you have to deliver that to your readers, but you can only kind of do it one scene at a time, like one little view. You can kind of only show one trait per per panel, as it were. Kind of figuring out which ones to show and in what order can seriously alter the way that your audience is reading your characters. And they might really love what they think your character is like, but you don't actually know what that picture is like until you either ask for like some clarification or until they say something that kind of tips you off to it. Because if you find yourself being like, boy, all my readers think that my characters are like a lot dumber than I think they are, or something like that, it's possible that there's something in the story that is kind of giving them that impression. And if you can figure out what it is, you can make little tweaks and kind of correct it. But you have to know it's there before you can address that sort of thing.
The power of peer review helps so much, especially in such a long kind of form story or storytelling with web comics and stuff like that. You know, you do the page, you post it, you kind of move and continue. I think it was we had said this in a previous episode, but it was really, really important to take that time to reread your work every so often that you can. I actually reread my own comic maybe once every 4 months to see if it's still holding up with some of the subtleties that we put in before and the characterizations are still making sense, so that, you know, when an arc comes to a close or a climax, it's giving that impact that you want. You still want that consistency, you still want that development to happen, and it's just like, it's really important to have the groundwork there for people to be invested too. I did have another question about this, so I don't go too far off topic anymore. Finn, you were talking about this previously, about kind of letting the characters go and figuring things out with Heirs of the Veil. So how can letting characters loose benefit the plot, and like what are the downsides of it?
So a character, if they're already well developed, will have their own wants, needs, and desires. So letting the character loose basically means having the character act on these desires. And if the characters don't act on these desires, you gotta figure out what makes them hold back, and you can basically use that to your advantage by figuring out the story. I think plots work best when they are character driven, so the desire of your character is directly connected with the plot. A big problem can be having a character that's basically only pushed around through circumstances without having a say in their own fate. The downside to this can be that if you follow every whim of your characters, the plot can be derailed. It is like Crispy said, you have to have a balance between the plot and the characters and their characterization. And I'm thinking of a quote by the Hunter x Hunter author Togashi, who in an interview once said that 3 characters can stand in front of a house and nothing will happen and the plot will not move forward if not one of these characters says, hey, let's go in.
Yeah,
That's so good. Getting lost in the banter is such a good way to put it too, because I feel like there's sometimes it could just be a lot of fun to have that back and forth between two characters and just really enjoy and sink into the dialogue. But some comics can totally do that. I mean, like we were going over in the intro, like there's not every comic needs to be fully plot driven. All of us are kind of coming at this from like a fantasy, sci-fi kind of genre fiction angle. And that's kind of where a lot of this advice is coming from, but it won't apply to like, Calvin and Hobbes or something like that. But with that said, if you are doing some sort of like big ongoing story epic fantasy slash sci-fi, which a lot of webcomickers are, we're talking to you. So just if you do get lost in the sauce, that's cool, but like check at every now and then that like you're not letting it go totally off the rails, and that you do kind of find a way to nudge them back in the direction of the plot every now and then.
It's always just important to do, kind of refocus and understand. It's just like, okay, what's the point of all this? And I always encourage people to be as indulgent as they can, because webcomics are a fantastic medium it's really diverse. You can get away with a lot. You can do so much with it. You can tell the stories that you want to do. But, when you're kind of just hemming and hawing and wondering where my readers at and how come they're not getting as invested in some of these things, some of the plot versus character can be like a symptom of that. Some of the meandering or, unclear plot or too much plot and not enough this could actually be a symptom of why people aren't as, engaging in your work, and they're not reacting to the things that you want them to react to. And some of the things actually do kind of get lost with that. And, it's just important to kind of just, like I said, focus, recenter, and just be like, all right, this scene is about these two characters biting each other's heads off. What was the point of it? Is it driving the characters? Are we going to be developing the characters? Is this something from their past that has to be brought up? Like, what's the significance of this thing? Not every single thing has to have a point, but I mean, you are still writing for other people to enjoy and read. So, you just got to consider kind of all angles of this stuff.
I think the way I like to see it is kind of that when you go through and you're reading a comic or watching a movie or whatever, usually the characters are what you will actually become invested in. When it comes right down to it, there's kind of three main hooks to a story, and one is character, one can be like very immersive world building and setting, and one can be kind of an intriguing mystery. But all of those things, they're kind of increasingly hard to get people to invest themselves in. And when it comes down to it, what a lot of people really come to fiction for is to see people and to see characters.
Yep.
And even when it comes to things like the mystery genre, which might seem to be the ultimate example of plot over character, a lot of the most successful mysteries have had at their center like a single character that the audience is following around, like the Sherlock or the Poirot and whatnot. And so one way that I kind of like to see it is that ultimately what your readers are there for are the characters. They want to feel invested in these people, but the plot is there to draw out the facets of the characters that lead people to get invested. Because how are you going to know about this character's like secret PTSD or something like that unless a plot event kind of draws it out and shows it to the reader? You can really bring out a lot more of the rounded facets of a fictional person by wielding the plot. It's your tool. Tool.
Oh dear. Yeah, but I think that's the point, like the interaction, because it's like a constant back and forth between what the characters do and what the plot dictates.
All right. Is there anything else that we kind of want to add to this topic?
Yeah, I think to come back to an earlier point we had about the development of characters in webcomics, and that webcomics take a very long time. Because I think what we also have to keep in mind is that developing the character and showing how the character develops like takes way longer in a webcomic than in other media, for example.
Yes.
And therefore it can be really hard to really keep track of the development of the character as the author, but also to kind of show the reader how the character is developing. And I think That's why I really want to like emphasize the point to just reread your works, like you said, Crispy,
Yes.
because it kind of helps you to actually keep track of how the character's developing.
Yeah, just to kind of keep yourself, like you said, in check and be like, okay, does this make sense? Oh, we're going that direction. Okay, we're all aboard here, because I think it's kind of funny when you start writing something that ends up being so long, and then you start writing contradictories because you're just going somewhere else with the plot. And it's just like, oh gosh, okay, this is a hot mess.
Yeah, because you can't really avoid that it's gonna get a little bit disjointed in your own head, because you're working like you're not working at the whole thing at once, but like small snippets of it.
Yep. Yeah. Definitely one of the last points that I want to say with this is developing a lot of, kind of things behind the scenes that can really help round and kind of ground your works. Like, not all info has to be presented to the reader, but knowing most of the answers will help you structure not only the plot, but the characters in it to be more likely like relatable, or they can feel more for both the plot and the characters. So this actually comes in handy when you want to write like subtleties or have rereadability in your works, or you've like, you've planned a lot and you've kind of put some stuff in there before to kind of, justify some of those answers or decisions that you've made throughout the story. And it's good to kind of read that as the author. And then, when you're in that hole and being like, oh gosh, how am I getting out of this, where I've written myself somewhere, you can kind of read back on that and be like, oh yeah, the character was acting like this, and I'm going to continue with that or something.
Yeah, I agree with everything.
You better.
Go team.
I disagree with everything, just because I want to start a fight now.
Oh no.
Oh my
This is
gosh,
character development for Finn.
I think this is kind of like not in character for Finn.
Oh no, I'm badly written.
I'm gonna give some critique.
Oh my god. Well, I think that wraps it up. That is a chicken salad Caesar wrap to go right there. I have been your host, Crispy, and you can find my work at ghostjunksickness.com.
I'm Finn, and you can find my work at heirsoftheveil.com.
And I am Thane, and you can find my work at chiralt.sevensmith.net or at witchwoodcomic.com. Was it a to-go because it's a short episode?
Yes! Oh my god, I'm hungry!
Thank you so much for listening to Screen Tones. Please subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to also follow us on Twitter at ScreenTonesCast.